Good morning. Last session before the keynotes and lunch, of course. So thank you very much for coming this morning. I want to give you a quick reminder. If you haven't grabbed it yet, get the Connect 16 mobile app. The reason you need that is because you need to give me 5 stars at the end of this session. So without it, you cannot, and that would be very sad. So I am Matt Ingenthron. I'm going to do a talk this morning on migrating from Mongoose and MongoDB to Couchbase using Ottoman.js. Ottoman.js is an ODM, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Just in case you didn't actually read the session description, this isn't really about general migration from MongoDB. This is about migration in the situation that you're coming from something like Mongoose. But I'll talk a little bit about a couple of other pieces of migration. As I mentioned, my name's Matt Ingenthron. I am a senior director in the engineering organization at Couchbase, and I can be reached through Twitter and email, of course. So how many folks here are developers? Everybody? You're in the dev track, right? So you should be. So I think we actually really all love JSON for our database. And the reason that we love JSON for the database is it really gives us that flexible data modeling. The idea that if I want to add a field to a record, I don't have to go call a DBA, put in a support request, go through a database migration. A couple weeks later, I'm actually able to start coding again, right? I have that flexibility. And I have really simplified integration with UI layers. So mobile apps, browsers, they all just expect JSON. You don't have to necessarily do anything special to be able to take that JSON and render it in a browser. But if I'm honest, even when I'm using Couchbase as my database, when I'm developing an interactive web app, there's still a lot of boilerplate. I still have to do things like actually model the data itself. Even though it's flexible, you still have to think about it a little bit. And realistically, a lot of the times, the model pops out of your object-oriented app. I also need to add things like validation logic. You know, validation, say with Angular in the browser, is great, except the browser can be hacked, obviously. So the user you can't rely solely on client-side validation. And with modern databases, and realistically even with relational databases, we don't usually do validation inside the database. So you need a place on the server side to make that validation relatively simple. You also need a place to create and build indexes to support the model behind that. Now, you can obviously do that manually, or you can use in the SDKs, we have a set of API for being able to manage indexes inside a cluster. But it might even be easier if we don't have to write all that boilerplate or code ourselves. So realistically, speaking of developers, speaking of you guys, we're all pretty lazy, right? When it comes down to it, that's one of the most prominent characteristics. And in some ways, that's actually a benefit to us, because if I give a developer, like if I were to give Sebastian a really boring task, after a couple of months of doing that same boring task, she's going to automate it, right? So that's the same thing that has happened with ORMs and ODMs. And so that is the reason that things like Ottoman exist. If we were to look at what's happening here in the document database world, so going back to what I said earlier, it's absolutely true that the impedance mismatch between the database and the application is not as high as it used to be. There is a lot more things like hierarchical objects and JSON map really well to modern apps, unlike having to necessarily, third normal form break things up among tables. That said, filling in that gap, what started to happen is that a number of projects that were ORMs started to take on ODM type capabilities, so object document mappers. In effect, we're replaying the pattern that we had previously with the ORMs now in this world of document databases. So if you were to go back and look, and I just did because I don't know, I guess I'm a nerd and I wanted to see where these things came from. If you go back, the oldest one I was able to find was Mongoid, which actually was an ODM for Ruby. And that is actually an official project of MongoDB. So that is the only one I could find that was an official project. And then there are a couple of other examples, things like Spring Data, which there was a session about earlier. it emerged as a way to work with other data. Those who had worked with Spring Framework, you probably know it works with Hibernate. Hibernate didn't exactly map to document databases, so Spring created Spring Data as the umbrella for all of the things that weren't relational databases. And now it's actually subsumed relational databases as well. Doctrine in the PHP world is a way to move from ORM to ODM. And even things like Hibernate, ORMs themselves had started to grow object, sort of a sub-fork of that. Now, in particular, there's one that we'll talk a little bit about here, and that's the focus of this talk, is Mongoose. So in the MongoDB world, these days people use Mongoose very frequently to build an application. In fact, I might suggest that almost any basic CRUD application really uses Mongoose, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But before I do, let's talk a little bit about what is in ODMs. So what do ODMs actually do for us? So ODMs, realistically, because we don't have to have the kind of complication that an ORM has to break things down into that schema underneath, what does an ODM do for us? Primarily, an ODM is really just a way to add some more schema to the model that's in your application based on object primitives. So you as an object-oriented developer, you probably just want to build JavaScript objects. And then you want those JavaScript objects to automatically turn into that model that's backing your application. But you probably need to make sure that things are going to serialize correctly, that you're able to handle things like references in there. Another thing that ODMs frequently do for you is they give you a very simple way of storing that data. Certainly all of us could go write the function that will handle receiving a JavaScript object, turning it into JSON, storing that JSON, but it might be simpler if there was something that just did that for me. I don't have to write that boilerplate piece of code because it's just a simple JavaScript object. Those also usually add sometimes ways of accessing data as well, the sort of singleton fetches, if you will. Imagine that I have a user or user profile, and I want to fetch a user based on their email address or based on their Facebook ID. I don't really need to go write all of the boilerplate logic for each one of those nickel queries. I could just have something like an ODM do that for me automatically. The ODM knows the model, so it knows what to do when I want to search for an email address or for that Facebook ID. The other thing that ODM does, as mentioned earlier, is it can give me that layer of validation I need on the server side. The server side is something that I, as an app developer, control, so that's the place where I'm going to put that additional validation to make sure I keep the data clean as it goes into the database or reject things that aren't meeting the particular format. And some of these ODMs also have a way of handling casting. So maybe if the user passes in a string, maybe my API, my public API, I want to be able to handle a string, but I want to be able to automatically convert that to a number, or maybe I'm going to do some additional formatting on it before I send it back out. Those are the kinds of things I might do through an ODM as well. So back to the title of the talk, though. How does all of this really relate to migration? Well, as I mentioned briefly a moment ago, I would suggest based on statistics, if you were to look at what happens in the MongoDB world, Mongoose really started to take off in about 2014, 2015. And these days, it is the predominant way that somebody builds a Node.js application against MongoDB. I don't know if anyone in this room has built an app like that, but that's the majority of people that are doing Node.js development against MongoDB. That's what they use. So about what would you say, something like 2014 or so, we decided to replay that into the Couchbase world. So we introduced Ottoman.js. I think we introduced it just before Couchbase Connect last year. And as you can see, we have a nice little hockey stick here. Ottoman has had lots of community contributions, and a number of people are now using Ottoman as the way to build their database applications. So let's look a little bit at Ottoman. So Ottoman.js, what does it do for us? So as we talked about with ODMs, the main thing that you'll see is that Ottoman gives you a way to easily define a JavaScript object model to become your data model. One of my colleagues here at Couchbase years ago, he talked about the idea that schema in this world of document databases is sort of emergent, right? You sort of start writing code, you're there on your local laptop, you don't have to deal with database migrations, and the schema will start to emerge as you start to build the objects that fit into the application. Where other frameworks like, say, Rails have to deal with how they're going to parse that up with active record into the database behind it. Things like ODMs don't have to do a lot of that work, but you do still have that data model. So in Ottoman, what I would do, just this is the beginnings of my Ottoman application, I obviously have to have a reference to Ottoman. I require Ottoman. I pass it a bucket to work with against Couchbase because it needs to have a place to persist its data. And then I can go start creating my model. So in this case, and this is straight off of Ottoman.js.com. We're playing the furniture theme out. We'll stay inside that area. So now we're creating we're going to create a model for furniture. And so any piece of furniture needs to have at least one thing in its model. It needs to have a name. So here I'm creating a model for objects of type furniture and give it a name string. As I mentioned, Ottoman frees you from that boilerplate of finding data that backs your model. So for example, if I wanted to go find all of the things that are tables, or find a table from my furniture database, all I need to do in this particular case is furniture.findByName. So I'm saying this is the parameter name. There is a property of that object, and if I wanted to search, and Ottoman will be able to do all of the work of searching for that for me. So I get generic finds very easily on top of that model. In this case, I would log it. Now, that will actually work without doing anything special, but this is Couchbase, right? And we want to make sure that we can make sure that that model will perform well and that we can scale that up. In order to do that, we need to be able to support multiple different indexing strategies and different creation of indexes. So Ottoman allows me to define in my model the kinds of indexes and indexing strategies that I might have for that data. For example, in the case of my furniture, maybe I want to index the names, and I know in advance that I want to use a nickel index to back this. It could actually be a couple of other kinds of indexes as well. So for example, I might actually use a refdoc index in some cases. Nickel and GSI are great for those kinds of things where you might do a range query. You know, go find me all the furniture where the name goes between two different values. Or go find me all the furniture created in 2011 and 2012, something like that. But sometimes if you really just need very quick direct access, you just want a simple document reference. I'm going to fetch this document, and then based on it, I'm going to fetch the other document, and then hand that back to the application. And so Ottoman has support for that kind of refdoc direct access. And then Ottoman will handle unpacking that for you into that object structure. You could also have view indexes. Now, I think we don't often talk about this. You can use view indexes, of course, directly from Nickel as well, or you can go straight to the views. There are some situations where you might use views, or if you have data that's changing very fast. In that situation, because of the way views works, where every node owns its own data, it's able to actually handle high rates of mutation and recalculate those very quickly. The other scenario where views are good are for when you're doing things like aggregations across a set of data. Views have some optimizations to be able to memoize that data inside. So Ottoman has support for all of those as well. So in order to create my index on names from my model, all I need to do is in the options block in my model, I add a by name, and I just say type nickel, and Ottoman takes care of the rest for me. I do actually need to call an ensure indexes or ensure indices function to have Ottoman see that from the model, from the compiled model, and then actually run it. But other than that, Ottoman takes care of it for me. Another thing that Ottoman will do for me is it has all of the data types, and it will make references and it makes things like references and default values simply declarative. So what do I mean by that? So say, for example, that situation where I have furniture, and now I want to extend my model. Now, on my furniture, I want to have a reference back to who the manufacturer is of that particular piece of furniture. So obviously, I'm going to need a new model. So in this case, I'm creating a model of manufacturers, and that has a couple of properties, string and city. So maybe in Mountain View or something like that, that manufacturer of furniture, and they have a name. But I also may want to have a default. So in this case, this probably isn't the most realistic example. Date is a very realistic example, although now is probably not the kind of thing I would use. But I may want to, when I'm creating a record, I don't want to have to type all that boilerplate code. So I just put into the model, when I create an object of this type, automatically fill in this field with that value. And it's just whatever code I want to put into that. And then you'll notice that we've extended the model on the furniture so that we now have the ability to refer to a type of manufacturer from that. So now, when I go look up my table, it's going to automatically pull in the manufacturer based on that reference. So I now have a way of actually describing relationships between the objects, and they'll still persist for me. Of course, the goal here was really to get rid of all the boilerplate for you, but there are lots of situations where you need to do things that are more custom. And I might even argue this is object-oriented programming, right? So we really want to be able to have functions that go along with the data, functions or methods that go along with the data. We don't want just data to be, data to sort of exist independently. So this again is straight out of the Ottoman.js website. For example, on that furniture model, I can go define a function, and that function then would have access to whatever is in the scope of that particular object. In this particular case, not a very exciting function, but I can just add a function that says dance. So if you were to try to call that function, all it's going to do in this case is log, I'm furniture, I do not dance. So back to that migration question again, right? So how does this actually help us in the migration case? There are two, in effect, if you have an application that's on MongoDB with Mongoose and you want to migrate to Couchbase, the best way to do that is really just to convert your existing Mongoose model to Ottoman. And then step two is move your data over, transforming as needed. Now, the reality of the matter is that step two is probably relatively complicated. But step one actually isn't too bad. And so we're going to do that right here. We're going to talk about what it would take to convert one of these. If you were to do a search for Mongoose getting started, this is the blog that would come up. And it's a pretty good blog. It's from modulus.io. I don't even know who they are. I think they might be a consulting company, but it's their blog. And they have a getting started, and it's a very popular blog. Really what it does is it defines a movie schema, creates some movies, and then accesses those movies through some simple data access methods. And then finally, they add some functions for more advanced data access. So I'm going to give you a side-by-side comparison of what that would be between Mongoose and Ottoman. So on the left-hand side here, what you have is Mongoose. In Mongoose, obviously, you have to have a reference to to Mongoose itself. That's just bringing in that dependency. And then I'm specifying a database connection. Then you will open the database. And Mongoose, and this is one place where Mongoose and Ottoman vary a little bit, is that in Mongoose you will then use the DB once, a function that's called one time when MongoDB connects, to put all of your schemas and models into that function. So then later when Mongoose Connect is called with a MongoDB reference, it will open the database and it will call that function, and that's where I put all of my models. In the Ottoman case, we're actually a little different. So we obviously have to have a reference to Ottoman. We have to have a reference to the cluster. And then Ottoman bucket, we need to open the bucket, give Ottoman a way to reference that particular bucket. And then we will call ensure indices. You might remember earlier when I was talking about the model, I can define indices that are going to automatically be put in. Now, that model will need to exist at the time that I call the ensure indices function, but you don't actually have to put all of your model compilation into that function itself. So there's a minor difference there. But functionally, it's pretty much the same. Then if you were to take, and I don't know why the formatting was like this on that blog, but I just chose to keep their formatting. So in Mongoose, if you want to define a schema, what they call a schema, in this case I'm creating a new movie schema. And that new movie schema has things like titles, ratings, release years, and whether or not it has a credit cookie. Those are the things that back that. Now in Mongoose, that's actually going to create a collection inside MongoDB. Couchbase is a little different, right? We don't usually use collections. Instead, we have a pattern that frequently comes out, and Ottoman is opinionated about that pattern in this particular case, where it will add a type field to your documents automatically based on the type of the object. So on the right-hand side, what you have is you have Ottoman defining a model, and we're defining movies. And our movies need to have titles, ratings, release years, and credit cookies. The other thing that I've done here is I've added, since we've already talked about it a bit, is I've added a specific index as an option to be able to create that index. Compilation of the model. In Mongoose, you have to call that model compilation at the time of connect, and that will create the collection if it doesn't exist. In the Couchbase case, there's actually nothing to do here. You need the model to have been created, but you don't need to actually go through this compilation step as you do with, well, the compilation step is a little different, if you will, right? It's just done by calling the functions earlier. So let's look at what creating and saving some data looks like. And now things almost start to look exactly the same, right? I'm creating a new movie, and I'm saying that movie has a title and a rating and a release year. In the case of Mongoose, it has some functionality for doing some of that casting. So it's taking a string of 2011 and it'll convert it to a numeric value. We don't do that at this moment in Ottoman.js. Obviously, if that's something you're interested in, we'd love to hear that. We'd love to get feedback on it. And then after that, really all you're doing on each side, on the left-hand side, I'm saving that object that I've created. I've created a variable Thor, so I'm saving that object. Right-hand side, pretty much the same thing. In a more complex application, you'd of course use that differently, but that just gives you a sense of how it works. Now, let's look at finding data. So if I want to find a movie in Mongoose, all I have to do is go against the model and do a find one call, and then it's passing in a JavaScript object, and that JavaScript object turns into my predicate that's going to turn into the query. So that will turn into a Mongo search or find for anything that has title Thor. On the right-hand side, we have a movie find. And so here I'm, again, passing in this JavaScript object. I'm saying I want to search for anything that's Thor, and then it'll call this callback. And Ottoman.js will convert that into a nickel query for me. So I don't actually have to define that nickel query. I don't have to write, even though it's a very simple kind of select sort of thing. Our goal here is to get rid of boilerplate, and so it does that for me automatically. However, there's something kind of cool here. I didn't create an index for the released year. But I can actually go find all the movies that were released in 2011. And what will happen in this particular case, I'm going to jump out of the presentation mode for a moment just to show you how this is actually represented in the console. So if I go to my Couchbase server, I go to my data buckets. If I were to look at indexes, and I have the model that we've been talking about here is in the default bucket, you'll notice that here's my movie title index. That's the one that was created automatically by Ottoman. So when I declared that as an option, Ottoman will create that when I call the ensure indices. But there's also this other one that is, oops, sorry, where'd it go? Type. Create index Ottoman type on default type with defer build true. So if I were to take something that's in the model, like that movie, and do a search, Ottoman automatically knows to constrain that search to only the things that match that particular type, and Ottoman will generate all those queries for me. So rather than it being failing back to the primary index, it will still use a narrower index of searching only those things that match that particular type. So kind of cool. Popping back to presentation. Now you might ask yourself, well, what do I get out of all this migration? What do we, so my other code's running. Well, the cool thing is that you still have all of those things that you want to do with Mongoose, but now you actually have Couchbase behind it instead of MongoDB, where you have to worry about all the sharding and how am I going to shard and what is my consistency model going to be. So you have GSI, global secondary indexes. You have nickel. You have view indexes for those kinds, like I said, those situations where you have high rates of mutation. You also now have the ability to support Couchbase can support the best options for you automatically. So as Couchbase evolves, Ottoman evolves to be able to add those new capabilities. And then you can scale that up to much larger sizes. So now that I've given a little bit of a sense of that, I want to take a couple minutes and do a walkthrough of a more complex application. This is an app called Comply. It lives up on GitHub under Couchbase Labs. It was written by Nick Raboy, who is a dev advocate here at Couchbase, working with Todd Greenstein. There's actually a series of webinars that talk about Comply in a few different cases. When they got to doing the Node.js version of it, they used Ottoman as a way to build the model behind it. So let me pop into that, and we'll walk through a real application. So the first thing I'm going to do in the app is I'm going to show you the app itself. Let me log out here. So this is Comply. If I were to register, it's just a regular sort of user registration. I'm going to log in this case. Comply, I actually need to find out exactly how the name came to be, but really what it is a task tracker. So it has behind it things like companies and users and tasks. And tasks can get assigned to users, and users can update tasks to completion. So as tasks move around between people. So I'm going to sign in here. Oop. So if I sign in, now you can see I have a set of projects. This is an AngularJS app. It looks like it's using some Bootstrap. I'm not sure about that, but it sure looks like Bootstrap to me. And then I have companies. So maybe I want to create a new company in this particular case. Somebody yell out their company name. That's for you. Somebody yell out your company name. Oh, there you go, MLB. Thank you very much. How was that World Series? So let's see, I have no idea where you are. Right? Well, no, I do know where you are because I've been to your office in New York anyway. But I don't remember the street. So we'll say, we'll call it 123 New York. I don't know where it is. New York. Oop. Zip, you guys start in the 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 10011. Almost sounds like a port number in Couchbase, but it's not. Country, USA, 212-555-1212. Website, mlb.com. I guess I should do that correctly. Now, I could have a validator behind that or some more complex logic, something like that, but that's all it takes to create a company in that case. Now, if I were to go into, say, projects and create a new project, I could create a project behind something like, I don't know, website for World Series and build one. And that is, so these, the name and description are things that I need in my model, for example. In there, I might have things like a set of tasks. Maybe I have a task which is build awesome site. We're going to say for MLB's World Series, and because we need to get the best expert we can on this, I'm going to assign it to Brett Lawson, who's the guy who wrote Ottoman. So he can handle this. I know he can. It'll build well and it'll scale well. And so that's all it takes to build a site. So that gives you a sense of what the projects are. I have projects and tasks, task history. Maybe Brett can pop in here and say, I don't have time for this. You do this, and assign it back to me. Basic application. Now, it doesn't seem like, it seems like if I were to have to hand code a lot of that, I would have to write a whole bunch of different boilerplate. Let's look at the code behind that. So I'm going to pop over here into IntelliJ. So in my Node.js app, I have here a set of models. So one of the first things I did was I logged in as a user, right? User model, this is using a number of those features that we talked about. When was the user created? We're just going to, at the time of user creation, we're going to return a new date. Automatically put that on the user. The user has to have a first name and last name, a set of strings, integers, country, and even a default in this case. So we're defaulting people to USA, which is sort of ironic since it was written by a Canadian. But hey, they play in the World Series, so it's okay. That's what makes it a World Series, is the fact that we have some Canadian teams. So then I have to have an email address. I have to have a reference to a company when the user is created. Whether or not that particular user is active, and of course the default is going to be true. There is, at some point in a future sprint, I'm going to add a way to disable users. Right now, they're always active. And then we have a couple of indexes. We're going to want to look people up by email address, by name.last, and by company. So those are the different ways I might want to index that particular model. And then others are similar. So we have to have a company. Company is defaulting to USA. And then we have something that's a little interesting here. We have a validator. So we have a phone validator. So I can pop into validators, and you can see that there is a way to validate that the phone number that's put in is actually a phone number. So I didn't try to trigger the invalid phone number, but if it did fail, then it would just throw an error back. Phone number is invalid. That will be returned back to Angular and displayed as an error dialog in Angular directly. We also have tasks, of course. Tasks, a lot of the same kinds of things that you've seen earlier. In this case, we have a number of different indexes. Maybe we want to find them by priority, or find them by status, find them by owner, and we've created indexes for all of these things. And most of that was, I now don't have to create myself. So that's the model here. So how does that model actually pop up in the application? Going back to the app, we see a lot of the same things that we talked about earlier. So I have a company, user, project, task, and I'm just including these from different files. As far as then I have to give Ottoman a bucket to work with. And then you might remember I mentioned earlier that you need to call that ensure indices. So all of that is doing at this point is, since Ottoman already knows about the different pieces of the model and the indexes that have been declared, I am now able to call ensure indices, and ensure indices will check to see if those indexes exist, and if not, it'll create them for me based on the definition. And then in this case, we created a default company just because we needed a way to bootstrap the application, and so that when we create a user, they can be assigned to a company. There might be a better way to do that in a real production application. So there's a piece here that creates a company named Couchbase, way out on the West Coast with a 9.4 zip code. So that's the app model creation, the indexes. Let's look at what the routes are in this particular case. So in a Node.js application, the way I access things, the way I want Angular to be able to access it, if I want to look up a user or a project, is through a route. So how does this work? In the case of maybe I want to look up a project by ID, really all I need to do in this case is the project model will just do a lookup by ID. I don't have to write all of that boilerplate code, and it's loading the users and tasks from that project and returning it to the browser. So it turns that into JSON, sends it back. I don't have to write the query. I don't have to worry about the index. It's already been declared. It's part of the model. So very simple routes. If I need to add something else, I want to find all of the tasks for a given owner. That owner ID is passed in as a parameter. So API project get all owner ID. And then based on that owner ID, we check to see if we have the request parameters. Then against that model, we'll call find by owner, get everything for that particular owner. Otherwise, in this case, I think what we're doing, correct me if I'm wrong, we're just falling back to if an owner ID isn't specified, we'll give you all projects for all owners. So we're kind of overloading that particular piece of the API. Some pretty basic stuff. Validators, as mentioned, I'd already kind of walked through validators, so you can have things like phone validator. Validators are custom logic, whatever is appropriate in your particular application. So if you want to validate that something is matching a particular format, or frequently, like this is one of my pain points with websites. When you go to a website and you type in the phone number and it says, no, you need to re-enter this with dashes. I'm like, well, you're the computer, just add the dashes. You know where they go. Come on. You can, for example, do that directly in your own application if you want to. So if you want to have custom logic in one of those functions. Final thing I want to show, well, I think I kind of already did, was the idea that I may have references. So say, for example, a task is going to be have a reference back to the company, I believe. Oh, I'm wrong. Let's maybe say a user is going to have a reference back to a company. Yeah, so that I can have those references defined inside that model. So that is actually all of the code to that application, at least on the Couchbase and the model side. There's a little bit more on the Angular side. Arguably, the Angular side is more complicated, which in some ways is good, because now I can really focus on the things that are useful for my user and get out of all of that boilerplate. So with that, whoops. If this looks interesting to you, I would like you to go to Ottoman.js.com. We actually have a separate website set up for this. Couchbase, we're just on the cusp of turning this into something. This is going to be a product from Couchbase. It's already a highly supported community project. So you don't, we've had a number of pull requests that come in that we've been able to introduce. Please also give us feedback. So through the forums, through the Node forum is probably the best location to catch one of us. Or, of course, through GitHub itself. You can post issues or whatever comes up. With that, let me ask, are there any questions? Yes?
Any comments or experience using Ottoman with Java framework like Spring, for example?
Yes. So the question is, just to repeat it, is any comments on interoperability, say, with Ottoman and a Java framework like Spring? So it does turn out that both Spring, and this is actually across 3 different things, Couchbase Mobile, Spring, and Ottoman are all inserting metadata into objects right now, and they do it in a not necessarily compatible way. That's mostly because they all had come out of separate projects and they had to live with the substrate that was there. One of the things that we're looking into in the future is how do we, as you probably already know, in Couchbase, every item really has metadata and data. We're looking to move all of that metadata into a separate section for metadata. And I hope one of the things that we're going to do, or I'm pushing this, is that we're going to kind of normalize a namespace the way that we store that metadata. So for example, then if you have Spring Data Couchbase, which Subhashini works on, you would be able to have that, the Java class defined in something that Spring Data Couchbase knows what to do with. And Ottoman would be able to use a similar, its own namespace for its own metadata. So reality right now, I don't know, Brett, do you think it would be even possible? If you could probably monkey code your way into that with Ottoman, but I don't know. Can you bring that mic up?
Is this working? Oh, yeah. Currently you can do some of this stuff. Like we've made it so that you can do direct documents between the two. So if you save a document, a movie type document in Ottoman, with a little bit of modification, it would work inside of Spring Data. The main part where we don't have a whole lot of compatibility is the way that we're dealing with references between documents and stuff like that. But just basic documents do work.
Cool. Any other questions? No? Is this interesting, I hope? Or you just want lunch? Or you want to know who's winning the election? I don't know. We won't know about that till 4. Oh, wait, one more question. Yep.
Any other comments on moving off of Mongo to Couchbase?
Question was, any other comments on moving off of Mongo to Couchbase? Yes, do it. No. I would say, and this is my own personal opinion after having observed this for like 6-7 years, Couchbase is moving dramatically faster than MongoDB is in terms of adding features and in terms of capabilities. I don't know how many people actually saw this because it took us a little while to get everything worked out. Pokemon Go went production. That was the authentication system was actually in part on Couchbase. And so when that went crazy, we also went crazy and we had to help them with a few things. But the reality is we were able to handle that. We're delivering things like full text search and so forth. MongoDB arguably has, my opinion, arguably has some significant architectural issues that they have not been able to overcome. Wired Tiger, which was the old Sleepy Cat people. I don't know how many people figured that out. They went from Sleepy Cat to Wired Tiger. They've been able to make incremental progress, but not a lot. That's my observation, and that's as somebody who's worked on some benchmarks to compare the two. So, admittedly, the migration of data is complex. But certainly doable. And we have a couple things we're working on, like a Talon connector, to give you some tooling to just be able to do that out of the box. So with that, I think we are out of time. So I want to say thank you. And before you leave the room, please install the mobile app and give me 5 stars. Only 5. 5 out of 5, that'll work. And also, one thing, this really does help if you're interested in Couchbase and seeing Couchbase succeed. Gartner is shifting from being just kind of old analysts by talking to individuals internally, and now shifting to a place where they want to hear directly from you. So we'd love it if you would give Gartner your unbiased opinion. Give me 5 stars and give Gartner your unbiased opinion. So with that, thank you very much.